It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger, Ho Chi Minh said back in 1946, about the then imminent war with the French. He went on to say, quote, "If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger does not stand still. He lurks in the jungle by day and emerges only at night. He will leap upon the back of the elephant, tearing huge chunks from his hide, and then he will leap back into the dark jungle. And slowly, the elephant will bleed to death." End quote. This time, in terms of the United States, the elephant would be even bigger. But the outcome, Ho Chi Minh claimed, would be the same. If you'll recall, my dear listener, one of the central themes we tried to establish about the Second Indochina War in the sort of trilogy of episodes that tried to explain some of the circumstances that leads that region into one of the 20th century's saddest conflicts, well, I tried to keep front and center this idea of the paradox of Vietnam, in terms of how successive US administrations meandered toward war while simultaneously bemoaning the act of doing so. We left off that part of the story toward the end of 1963, following the collapse of the Diem regime in the South, the assassination of Kennedy, and the baton being passed to President Lyndon Johnson. This certainly altered the course of the war. While some had hoped that Diem's removal would strengthen South Vietnam, in reality, it mostly served to show just how deeply weak the South Vietnamese government was, and highlighted its fragile legitimacy. The generals who had, in league with some American interlocutors, overthrown and murdered Diem would usher in what is generally referred to as a period of revolving door politics in Saigon, during which the generals who ousted Diem were they themselves turfed out, and following governments were installed and fell with an alarming frequency, to paraphrase Edward Miller. And just to sort of give a little peek behind the curtain here, we can listen in on this Vietnam paradox being neatly highlighted. Here is a recording of a conversation between President Johnson and his National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, from May the 27th, 1964, about half a year into the new president's reign.
I'll tell you, the more I just stayed awake last night thinking about this thing, the more I think of it, I don't know what in the hell. It looks like me we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I believe the Chinese communists coming into it. I don't think that we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home and ever get anywhere in that area. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out. And it's just the biggest damn mess I ever saw.
It's an awful mess.
One thing that is Vietnam worth to me? What is Laos worth to me? What is it worth to this country?
No, we have to.
Now we got a treaty, but we got a treaty, but hell, everybody else got a treaty out there, and they're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you start running the communists, they may just chase you right into your own kitchen.
Yeah, that's the trouble. And that is what the rest of that half of the world is going to think if this thing comes apart on us. That's the dilemma. That's exactly the dilemma.
But everybody I talk to that's got any sense now, they just says, "Oh my God, please give us thought." This is a terrible thing we're getting ready to do.
Mr. President, I just think it's the only big decision in one sense that has this one.
And here is another from the same day with Senator Richard Russell Jr., who was a kind of mentor for LBJ.
What do you think about this Vietnam thing? What I'd like to hear you talk a little bit.
Frankly, Mr. President, if you were to tell me that I was authorized to settle it as I saw fit, I would respectfully decline to undertake it. It's the damn worst mess I ever saw, and I don't like to brag. I never have been right many times in my life, but I knew we were going to get in this sort of mess when we went in there, and I don't see how we're going to ever get out without fighting a major war with the Chinese and all of them down there in those rice paddies and jungles. I just don't see it. I just don't know what to do.
Well, that's the way I've been feeling for
It's deteriorating.
6 months.
Our position is deteriorating, and it looks like the more we try to do for them, the less they're willing to do for themselves. I just don't know. It's a tragic situation. It's just one of those places where you can't win. Anything you do is wrong.
Well, they'd impeach a president, though, that'd run out, wouldn't he? I just don't believe outside of Morris, everybody I talked to says you got to go in, including Hickenlooper, including all the Republicans. None of them disagreed with him yesterday when he made the statement that we had to stand. And I don't know how in the hell you're going to get out unless they tell you to get out. Wouldn't that pretty well fix us in the eyes of the world, though, and make us look mighty bad?
Well, I don't know. We don't look too good right now. And, of course, you look pretty good, I guess, going in there with all the troops and sending them all in there. But I'll tell you, it'll be the most expensive venture this country ever went into.
I've got a little old sergeant over that works for me over at the house, and he's got 6 children. And I just put him up as the United States Army and Air Force and Navy every time I think about making this decision and think about sending that father those 6 kids in there. And what the hell are we going to get out of his doing it? And it just makes the chills run up my back.
It does me. I just can't see it.
I haven't got the nerve to do it, and I don't see any other way out of it.
So, what are we getting from this, folks? And remember, both people he is talking to, there's this tremendous respect between them. This is real talk. This is like speaking to a couple of your best friends about doubts you might be having about a relationship. It sounds like we have a president who knows just how bad it is getting, just how dangerous it is, openly saying that it's a terrible thing that we are getting ready to do. What the hell is Vietnam worth to me? What is Laos worth to me? What is it worth to this country? He talks about sending in a father of 6 to Vietnam, and that giving him chills. How it seemed like the more the US was willing to do for South Vietnam, it seemed like the less they were willing to do for themselves. He talks about the treaty with South Vietnam, and says, well, hell, everyone else got a treaty out there, and they're not doing anything about it. And then, just when you think the inescapable conclusion is get out, you hear him perfectly articulate the paradox, talking about running from communists and them chasing you into your own kitchen, how the people might impeach a president who was seen as running out. On going in there, he says he hasn't got the nerve to do it, and he doesn't see any other way out either. Now, we have gone over this a bit before, this idea about, well, does it even make sense to say the Vietnam War? But whatever you want to call it, it's also hard to say when it starts. But if I were to offer my own completely unqualified opinion, it would be this same year that the conversations we just listened to take place. 1964. Escalation is set in stone by the end of that year, and it will be by air, by invasion, or both. Now, the reason why I think it starts in 1964 is because if we are using the term escalation, I don't think it is escalation to something. It is escalation of something that is already existent. It's no longer the path to the Second Indochina War. It is the path of the Second Indochina War. G'day everyone, welcome back to In the Shadows of Utopia. Before we start proper, just another thanks to everyone for listening. I know some of you have been here from the start, which was 5 years ago now, so that's amazing. And again, I want to thank everyone who has left reviews or ratings or gotten in touch since the last episode. Seems like travel is on the cards again for a lot of people. I've been getting a few emails about visiting Cambodia or people who started listening while they were on holiday. Very cool. I hope you all enjoyed your trip, will enjoy your trip, or if you are there right now, I hope you have a lovely day. Also, like usual, big thank you to everyone who has donated to the show or who is supporting the show via Patreon. A little minor charity update on that front. Now, as well as the Cambodian Children's Fund, I've added Animal Rescue Cambodia. Great work they are doing for kitties and puppies on the streets of Cambodia. Very happy to help them out. Okay, and with that, just another minor point. Apologies if you detect any sort of flu-like symptoms in my voice. A little bit under the weather about a week ago, so I hope that doesn't come through too clearly. And again, I think this is the third country in as many episodes to have written and recorded an episode. So if there's any background audio that sounds a little bit out of place, I do apologize for that too. Still getting used to these new surroundings. But anyway, let's get back to the story here. We are going to split this episode up roughly into 3 parts, naturally all interlinked and dependent on each other. What podcast did you think you were listening to? But we are going to begin with the Vietnamese side of things, then the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge side of things, and then the Sihanouk Cambodian politics side of things, covering about 3 to 4 years from about 1964 to 1967. So from that prologue at the start with LBJ and that, well, what I consider a very pivotal year of 1964, I've sort of given away the ending a little bit already, but, well, I'm not sure if you can really give away the ending for something that happened more than half a century ago. But what I purposefully left out was the aftermath of the Diem regime, the North Vietnamese and NLF moves, and the sticky ways in which the United States gets to that point where all-out war is at hand. I might just say this as well, sort of as a disclaimer, sort of as a means to an end for myself, brevity-wise, and I think I've said this before, but I'm not an expert on the Vietnam War, nor Vietnam, nor Cambodia, really. My get-out clause is that I'm a student of that history, not a historian by any stretch. But my larger point here is that Vietnam is just a massive, massive topic. But I found the most useful thread to get us through that part of the story, without getting too bogged down in, well, everything, is to use this theme of the Vietnam paradox that I just brought up. So keep that in mind as we sketch out some context and detail here. And the other thing that I think is worth keeping in and around your thoughts as you hear some of my explanation here, remember, if we're using the phrase Vietnam War, as useful or not as that term is, it is really the resumption of a Vietnamese civil war, not just a proxy conflict in the Cold War. Anyway, after Diem's assassination and with the prospect of a new US president not long after, the Vietnam Workers' Party convenes to consider their next moves at the end of 1963. Naturally, there was a kind of optimism tinged with caution kind of thing going on in this particular point in time. For sure, you've got a destabilized South Vietnam, worth taking advantage of, with a stepping up of your offensives there, and perhaps even a chance to decisively claim victory against a weakened opponent, wherein the United States weren't fully protecting yet, with, a few 100,000 troops. Now, on the flip side of that, you've got to actually be pretty cognizant of the risk there. What if this attempt is kind of like coming after a wounded animal? What if this provokes the new president to massively retaliate in a way that previous US administrations had always just sort of equivocated about? Well, to paraphrase Edward Miller, there was a suitable amount of debate between the senior Vietnamese communists, with much resistance from Ho Chi Minh. But in the end, it was the new Vietnamese Workers' Party chairman, the Southerner who has been staunchly pushing this for years now, Le Duan, who will eventually secure the approval for his plan. It was known as Resolution 9, which has a wonderfully, it's like if you say it just right, it takes on such gravitas. Resolution 9. It's like if you say Plan B. With enough emphasis, it sounds quite ominous. This was, as Miller says, a huge gamble. This is the let's get this done right here and now, before the US can do anything to stop it kind of gambit. Le Duan was betting that by mobilizing large numbers of North Vietnamese troops and infiltrating them into the south, well, that, combined with the NLF, Viet Cong for those who may have forgot, they could win large-scale victories and trigger a series of communist-fueled uprisings in urban areas. So this tells us two things. One is that Le Duan and his supporters are in the ascendancy, and the old guard, like Ho Chi Minh, are remaining more as important symbolic figures, but they are not having the final word on proceedings. Uncle Ho was in his 70s at this point, and as I said, the more cautious among the Vietnamese Politburo were marginalized in favor of the Hawks. The second is that this is another example of the these interesting dynamics. The Vietnam War is not just Vietnam against America. There are contending forces even within one side of the conflict, and that is just at the micro level. You've also got the Sino-Soviet split, this widening gap in relations between China and the Soviets, and who is in what camp and who is a revisionist and who is a deviationist. That will come into sharp focus over the next few years as well. Not to mention the relations vis-à-vis the Cambodian communists and their nominal comrades in Vietnam. But also, what this means is that the North is committing to the liberation of the South. They are escalating, just as the United States will do. If at the most basic level the US-backed coup of Diem was an attempt to shorten the war, it backfired. The North was emboldened, and the South faced even more political problems of stability. So as the North ramped up with Resolution 9, this would present a new problem to a new president. Coming in the wake of expansion of the US presence in Vietnam in the previous two administrations, and remember being more or less the same administration as Kennedy at this point, the prospect for a re-evaluation of the entire program was distant. Johnson was publicly in support of protecting the South from communist aggression. In his second week in office, he said, quote, "We should, all of us, let no day go by without asking whether we are doing everything we can to win the struggle there." End quote. He, too, accepted the kind of, we might as well just say domino theory, and the strategic importance of the region in the wider Cold War. So this brings us back to the paradox of Vietnam, when we consider the inward conversations he was having, as well as some of the expressions of doubt he had raised before he was president. But there is another influence here, and it is one that we have discussed before about the nature of bipartisan American politics and the election cycle, where the Democrats were always a little anxious about being considered soft on communism, and therefore open to attack from the Republicans on that issue. This was particularly exacerbated in 1964, an election year, and by an ambitious domestic program known as the Great Society that Johnson wanted to initiate. It was all about the promotion of civil rights, fighting poverty, improving education and healthcare, and it was Johnson's real focus. But he felt that if he was seen to be weak on communism, with South Vietnam's potential loss being something that could have produced an extreme amount of backlash, well, he would have then hurt his chances of gaining support from conservatives for his domestic agenda. Again, this administration, like the last, was faced with this dilemma. Can't lose South Vietnam, but don't want to commit so much to a clearly deteriorating situation. It is within the first half of 1964 that both of those recordings I played you earlier were sourced. The confession that the whole thing was just a big mess, but followed by lamenting that they could not be seen as weak and leave. This will eventually coalesce into the decisions to ramp up the American military presence, but not in a dramatic way that would hurt his prospects in the upcoming election. As Mark Atwood Lawrence says, the trick was to display firmness on the Vietnam issue while deferring any dramatic moves until after the election. Part of these maneuvers included increasing military advisors in the south, as well as commando raids into the north. Alongside this were intelligence gathering operations at sea, where US Navy warships would come into rather close proximity with North Vietnam's coast. Notably, historically even, in and around the region known as the Tonkin Gulf. Now, anyone with even a cursory knowledge of the Vietnam War will probably have felt their ears prick up when the words Tonkin Gulf were heard. What will happen there is very famous, and I think for some probably has a similar feeling evoked when they hear, WMDs or something similar. The Gulf of Tonkin incident and its subsequent resolution, there's that word again, have they occupy a large space in the context of the Vietnam War, but they have transcended that also, and will likely come up in more generalized conversations about US foreign policy, interventions, and wars. So with that in mind, I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining what happened there in August of 1964, and its importance. And to anyone who might be disappointed that I don't include any conspiratorial theories into the mix here, I'm sorry, but the more mundane, the events as they really happened, are interesting in their own right, and perhaps damning in their own way, particularly in how it played out, how it was used, and how it was projected to the public, as well as what it demonstrates in terms of how prepared the Johnson administration had become for the complete escalation of the war. Okay, so with that slight preamble, when explaining this incident, it is important to remember what provokes it. As we just said, the US is indirectly attacking the North through these South Vietnamese commando raids, as well as gathering naval intelligence close to North Vietnamese waters. One of the vessels involved in these operations was the USS Maddox. On the 2nd of August, while supporting, at some distance, a South Vietnamese commando raid that had occurred over the last couple of days, the Maddox was engaged by 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Now, what happens to the Maddox is fairly straightforward. It fires warning shots at the approaching vessels, then opens fire as they continue their approach, and then they both exchange fire. A nearby US aircraft carrier sends one jet, which takes some damage in the scuffle and damages 2 of the torpedo boats, while the Maddox itself sinks the 3rd boat with a direct hit from one of its 5-inch guns. The Maddox sustains no real damage bar a single bullet hole. There were no US casualties, but I believe 4 North Vietnamese were killed and a handful injured. What happens next is where it gets a little more convoluted. In the wake of the first attack on the Maddox, the USS Turner Joy was summoned to join it in the resumption of the kinds of patrols they were doing off the coast. On the 4th of August, US officials reported that both the Maddox and Turner Joy had come under attack once again, engaging in another battle. Now, key to this is at the time, these vessels were interpreting sonar data as evidence for North Vietnamese ships, as well as previously intercepted communications from North Vietnamese that were supposedly indications that an attack was imminent. However, the thing is, there simply were no Vietnamese ships in the area. The sonar readings may have been the result of rough seas and bad weather. Later investigations pointed to the intercepted communications probably being in relation to the attack that had occurred on the 2nd, which had actually occurred and relayed North Vietnamese messages about retrieving their downed and damaged torpedo boats. Now, part of this whole thing is the communications technology and speed at the time, which in comparison to today's is a couple of fractions slower, obviously. And given just how quick the Johnson administration reacted to the Gulf of Tonkin incident on the 2nd, and the supposed Gulf of Tonkin incident on the 4th, I think it is relevant. Basically, less than 6 hours after news of this second attack, Johnson gives a speech to the nation, saying that the US Navy had come under unprovoked attack at sea, sort of massaging the language there to make it seem like these attacks had occurred in international waters, and was careful to put the US Navy within a defensive sort of posture, rather than include all of the detail about the patrols, commando raids, and general assertiveness that they themselves had been engaged in. A bombing raid of North Vietnamese targets occurred just a few hours after his speech was delivered. By that point, however, it should be noted that investigations into what had occurred in the supposed second attack could have easily cleared this up to a point that there was no second attack, but there was a degree of using selective evidence. Almost like receiving one letter that says it was true, noticing a second letter had arrived, giving that one a cursory glance and saying, I think I like the first letter more, let's go with that. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was also choosing to ignore further intercepted North Vietnamese communications that were basically saying, hey, don't engage. What are you, crazy? To their own navy. To posture the North Vietnamese as relentlessly aggressive was simply not the case here. And a sort of nothing burger was embellished into a major act of war. Now, I would hesitate to call this a classic example of the slightly, them's big words, aren't they? But this to me is not a false flag, nor is it overly conspiratorial. And yes, while it is, in Australia we might say it's a little dodgy, but let's be honest, the so-called Vietnam War, to an extent, is already on. US military advisors have already been killed, the Battle of Up Back has already occurred, the US has been spraying chemical defoliant all over the joint. The Gulf of Tonkin incident and resolution seems to me more like a kind of marketing team exercise. The United States is projecting itself as this savior of the West against the scourge of creeping communist tyranny. It is protecting poor old South Vietnam against this terrible threat, and therefore the rest of Asia, and even my little island of Australia. For an administration already making plans for escalation in these efforts, rather than making any backward strides, this provides them an opportunity. You can play this as the other side being needlessly aggressive, while all you were doing was having a bit of a sail around in international waters, which certainly isn't the whole picture. I'm reminded for some reason of a fairly common occurrence on the football pitch, or soccer for my American friends, where a player might just sort of front up to an opposition player after an altercation, really get in their face kind of thing. And then, if the player responds to that by even nudging the other player's face with their forehead, then they are able to sell that as being headbutted. They can fall to the ground clutching their face, searching for blood on their hands, and the offending player is likely to be given a straight red card for violent conduct. Now, the United States they aren't exactly asking to be attacked. This, to me at least, isn't this case where they are trying to provoke the North Vietnamese so that they can have this golden ticket of war waging, but they are sort of doing everything up to that. Now, to return to the football analogy, some of you might remember one of the most infamous examples of a headbutt on a pitch, the 2006 World Cup final. That was a proper headbutt. What the Johnson administration will do is attempt to sell the Gulf of Tonkin incident as if they were Materazzi and North Vietnam was Zinedine Zidane. But the reality is that this little tiff at sea, the United States were barely touched, and they've gone down pretty dramatically. Now, just because I don't think what happened there is this conspiratorial false flag scenario, it is definitely a little smelly. The incident was quite simply not what it was sold as, and it was far from this clear-cut example of communist aggression. But President Johnson will use it to secure sweeping powers to employ military force in Southeast Asia. They present it as this case of honor, where they ask the question, can we not defend ourselves if we are fired upon? Which is almost perfectly insulated from arguing against for the majority of American citizens and politicians. As Edward Miller puts it, quote, within days, both houses of Congress had endorsed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the text of which had been drafted by the White House before the incident took place. Johnson immediately used the authority conferred by the resolution to launch a retaliatory airstrike against North Vietnam, the first such US attacks of the war. Although Johnson portrayed these airstrikes as a one-time operation and insisted the United States sought no wider war, he would later cite the Tonkin Gulf Resolution as the legal basis for the subsequent massive expansion of the US military involvement in the conflict. End quote. This whole affair serves Johnson very well. First of all, he can present his administration as tough to conservatives in Congress and the public, and he sees a 30-point surge in his approval ratings. He is now invulnerable to conservative attacks in the upcoming election about any supposed weakness. And he doubles down on this in an interesting way, which is kind of what we alluded to earlier. They weren't going to do anything dramatic before the election, and he toes this kind of moderate line at the same time. At one point during his campaigning, he says he isn't going to send American boys thousands of miles away to fight a war that the people living there should be fighting, which allows him to capture the sympathy and votes of centrist positions who, despite not wanting communist expansion, still didn't want to involve American troops directly. This approach, coupled perhaps with the fact that Kennedy had been killed, and I'm sure a variety of other circumstances that elude a fairly shallow grasp on American politics in 1964, well, this produces a landslide election victory for Johnson, the largest in American history. Johnson basically has a mandate from the American people like no other. He could have pulled out of Vietnam with no political consequence, as it was the beginning of the presidential term. But sadly, perhaps this last and best opportunity to get out was turned down in favour of war. And if I return to that football analogy once again, it's as if, yes, the North Vietnamese player gets a red card. But on the replay, everyone can see that the ref has been fooled to an extent. Maybe he was going by the book, but it just doesn't look like there was enough there for a red card. The home crowd gets behind their team like nothing else. The media, watching and commentating, question the ethics of the American player, and the North Vietnamese team are completely emboldened to play right to the death and still get a result against the visiting team, even with less players on the pitch. The airstrike against North Vietnam almost has the opposite effect than intended. Hanoi sends regular troops into the south for the first time. Their population, now the victims of unprovoked terror from the skies, becomes committed to the cause. And the North Vietnamese braces itself for a conflict with the United States by gaining even more military aid from China and the Soviets. This cycle of escalation is ratcheted up several notches. Johnson makes moves to turn a Vietnamese war into an American one. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, coupled with the lack of political constraints, allowed him to literally take all necessary measures to resist aggression in Vietnam, and dramatic steps were taken just months after his election. Johnson approved aerial bombing in a two-stage plan. The first would be of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, in what was called tit-for-tat retaliation against attacks in the south. The second was a sustained campaign against the north itself, Operation Rolling Thunder, which would over a 3-year period drop nearly 1 million tons of ordnance. This horrifying commitment would also necessitate more ground troops to protect US air bases, and on the 8th of March, 1965, Marines were sent to Da Nang in South Vietnam. During the summer of 1965, he authorized the deployment of 100,000 troops and indicated that he would send more if requested to do so. This was still seen in Washington as a kind of gradual plan. They were hoping to increase the pressure step by step to find a breaking point for Hanoi where they would sue for peace. Johnson said that, "I'm going up old Ho Chi Minh's leg an inch at a time." And while this new stage in the conflict obviously caused problems for the North and the National Liberation Front in the South, they predicted that the Americans would be ill-suited to a conflict in the jungles and rice paddies, a guerrilla war, and that the American public would not be able to stomach a long war, to paraphrase Mark Atwood Lawrence in his concise history of the Vietnam War. And they would prove to be correct. The North would, quote, not count the cost. But even at this point, the paradox still remained. While troops flooded into South Vietnam to begin fighting this war, some in Johnson's administration, like George Ball, were still explaining that escalation would not lead to victory, and that this was still the time to negotiate themselves out. that a few short-term costs could avoid catastrophic losses. But this would not be the case. It will cost millions of lives. And for Johnson personally, his domestic vision, as well as his presidency, and even his legacy. So, as we step away from the Vietnam War, for the time being, it strikes me that from this point in the story, and for a good chunk of what is to follow, there is a kind of blurring of the borders between Vietnam and Cambodia, as the region itself descends back into prolonged conflict once again. And the actual physical border will be an important part of that conflict, as we will find out. But even at a superficial level, something like the decision to begin an extensive bombing campaign of Vietnamese targets and targets which support those Vietnamese, hoping to topple the southern regime, will affect those in Cambodia and those with similar aims. And in the same way, there was this galvanization of the view of the United States by some, in the United States, as this necessarily reactive agent against the tide of communism. Well, there is a similar mirroring of that by those of an opposite political persuasion, native to these lands, where the US becomes solidified into this imperialist grim reaper spreading death and destruction and the subjugation of those people it proclaimed to protect. This was war, again, and there became a need to pick sides and act. Now, as we turn our attention to the Cambodian communists, recall for a moment, my dear listener, where we had left revolutionaries like Nguyen Chia and Pol Pot in the last episode, hunkered away in the border regions with Vietnam in a headquarters known as Office 100. The future leaders of the Khmer Rouge had begun formulating their own ideology, their own plans, their own revolution. They were still very much under the wing of their Vietnamese comrades, but had begun to truly bristle at the somewhat patronizing relationship the two shared. And life was pretty rough in these jungle encampments. Chim Sihanouk, a party member who would relay some of his experiences in Office 100 in a confession later extracted from him at S21 about 13 years later. And this is from Chandler's Brother Number 1. Quote, "I met Brother Number 1 at Office 100. I was excited and very happy, for I hadn't imagined that he would be there. At that time, I couldn't tell the brothers, that is the leading party personalities, apart. After a while, I learned who Brother Number 1 was, and Brother Van, who was Ieng Sari. The work was a real struggle. It went on even if you had malaria. I saw the brothers, Sa and Sari, writing documents, preparing stencils, and printing the documents. I tried very hard to study with them. After a while, I was able to help them to an extent, writing and publishing secret documents myself. In Office 100 in 1964 to 1965, I was very happy. No problems arose to confuse me. I believed that I was building myself, constructing a new revolutionary personality and making progress." End quote. Apart from it being a bit sad that this person who is being tortured and this confession extracted from them reflects on happier times in the jungles of Vietnam. Anyway, another party member at Office 100, a paramedic under Ieng Sari, and also from a confession from S21, noted that Cambodians had not been allowed outside the base by the Vietnamese who guarded it. And Chandler questions what kind of psychological impact that might have had on what he describes as the proud men of the Cambodian revolutionary leadership who were living in these circumstances. I think the most salient point which illustrates resentment on the part of the Khmer Rouge toward the Vietnamese revolves around the notion that the Cambodian movement wanted what the Vietnamese had. If you'll recall from last episode where we discussed Steve Heder's sort of thesis about Khmer Rouge ideology, and he mentioned how there was a kind of Vietnamese blueprint that the Cambodian communists were following. They wanted to shift from, in communist revolutionary parlance, from political struggle into armed struggle, just like the Viet Minh had done against the French, and just as the National Liberation Front had done against the Diem regime. And I suppose it's worth just quickly saying that, political struggle is trying to bring about your political goals via political means, like elections, public appeal, through newspapers and speeches. You might consider political struggle in terms of, say, a particular aggrievement within your own society or country. Let's say it's, nurses. There's this feeling that nurses are overworked and underpaid. There might be an attempt to unionize within members of that profession. They might lobby their local politicians. They might stage strikes, appeal to the wider public through the media, ideally gaining enough support through these means that they are able to successfully turn their issue into a political focus, which might be campaigned upon by different political groups who can leverage this support into votes, then into a parliament seat where they can attempt to pass laws which support these nurses' aims. An armed struggle, in the same way, and again it's fairly simple to say, but it's essentially what is turned to when this political struggle does not come to fruition, or indeed in an environment where there is a reliance on violence or imprisonment by the state, where any outward political message that is deemed antithetical to the ruling group is not tolerated. The political struggle shifts into something which uses the same methods and violently attempts to make its goals reality, even if it means toppling the entire government to do so. This is where the Cambodian communists are at in early 1965. They've been stuck on political struggle for about 10 years. They convene a meeting in January of the Central Committee and decide that revolutionary violence was the necessary aim. This is agreed upon. These kinds of meetings could be thought of in terms of, like core business goals that are discussed and adopted by leadership structure and disseminated amongst their managers of various branches and departments. Like, here's the fall quarter review or whatever, and these are the results, and this is the focus for the next quarter, something like that. This January 1965 plenum of the Central Committee of the Khmer Workers' Party also decided that it was a desirable time for Pol to lead a group to visit Hanoi and discuss matters with the leadership of the Vietnamese Workers' Party. They want a party-to-party chat. Up until this point, the leadership who had abandoned Phnom Penh and fled to the Marquise were more or less in a camp of the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, which is not the same as being side by side with the leadership of North Vietnam. The Cambodians were in contact with the Southern Bureau, as it were. A couple of points on this. One is that this really does signal, it's a projection of where the Cambodian communist movement felt it was at. They had renamed their movement from the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party to the Khmer Workers' Party, in a way that sort of, this is all part of that communist rhetoric and vocabulary of the time, but it's saying, we are at this level. Oh, is that the same level as the Vietnamese Workers' Party? Well, what an interesting coincidence. Another point is that it is, it's like the young man or woman, full of ideas and enthusiasm, putting on their finest suit or dress and feeling ready to mix with the grown-ups. To say, I can have adult conversations, I'm coming to the party and I would like to be treated as my own person, rather than an extension of my parents or something like that. From a Vietnamese perspective, they're eager to get a look at the guy who succeeded to somewhat, as well as discuss strategy, given the escalation of the war. And don't forget about more than 1,000 Cambodians who had been part of the Khmer Viet Minh that actually relocated to Hanoi following the end of the war with the French. This was nominally their leader too. By April of 1965, their delegation is approved to visit Hanoi. They set out from Office 100, which is sort of in the southeast of the border between Cambodia and South Vietnam, and they head up into the northeast of Cambodia, around Ratanakiri, and then onto the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This network of footpaths at this point, they follow this into the mountains of southern Laos and then into North Vietnam. This takes more than 2.5 months to complete. It's also kind of interesting how this famous network of trails doesn't simply supply weapons, supplies and troops, but also revolutionaries and their ideas. Now, if this was this scenario with the, 18-year-old getting ready for their first big showing of how adult they were at the big table, maybe hoping to discuss some big ideas they had and impress some people, well, they are going to have a somewhat disappointing evening. Upon arriving in Hanoi, the Cambodian delegation is treated with cordiality and respect. Pol is given an audience with Ho Chi Minh, who, as we said before, was in his mid-70s, almost double the Cambodian's age. And in this more symbolic mode, the bulk of the talking is done by Le Duan. Philip Short has a little description of him here, which I think is worth including. Quote, Le Duan was 20 years SARS senior, a dour, rather uninspiring man, who owed his rise to his bureaucratic skills and unquenchable patriotism. End quote. Pol and Le Duan will meet several times during this sojourn in North Vietnam, and it is he who hands the Khmer revolutionary most of the disappointing news that he did not want to hear. I'll explain this all in a bit more detail, but just to put it quite simply, Pol comes to Vietnam essentially to say, we want to start armed struggle against Sihanouk. It's our time to have the same revolutionary war that you did. And the response is basically, no. Now, why is this a big deal? Why is this the answer? Well, we will get to the state of Cambodian politics more in the last part of the episode, but remember at this point, Sihanouk has severed relations with the United States. Not only that, but he is much friendlier with the North Vietnamese than the South. So much so that only a couple of months prior to Pol coming to Hanoi, Sihanouk had negotiated or begun negotiations with the NLF to establish more permanent sanctuaries on Cambodian soil, rather than the status quo up to that point, which was to just kind of turn a blind eye to those brief incursions. It was also during a point where Sihanouk was beginning to look at this deal with the Chinese, who would ship supplies and weapons to come through the port of Kampong Som, through Cambodia, and into the hands of the Vietnamese war effort. More on that later. In essence, Sihanouk was an ally in an important strategic location for the NLF and the North Vietnamese. The other half of this equation really comes down to the realities of war making as well. Just as the North Vietnamese had been slightly dubious about the idea of promoting a full-on armed struggle in the South by the NLF, but eventually conceded to doing so, the whole Vietnamese Communist war effort would be hugely complicated by opening up another front in that war in Cambodia. For all the rhetoric about not counting losses and tigers and elephants, it's just a massive headache to pile another huge amount of food onto an already overflowing plate. There were hundreds of thousands of American troops coming ashore in South Vietnam, and that is where the focus had to remain. Essentially, Le Duan recommended that the Cambodians combine building bases in the countryside, but remaining unarmed, keeping on, trying to infiltrate Parliament and the government and building this anti-US imperialist stance everywhere they could, particularly with Sihanouk. Then, if he's overthrown or if Vietnam wins the war, well then the Cambodian communists will be in position to struggle violently to gain power, with Vietnamese assistance. Now that actually might have been a better way of putting it to Pol Pot than Le Duan actually did. Rather than appealing to these realities, Le Duan attempted to dissuade the Cambodians of this armed struggle by saying that maintaining political struggle was this noble thing to do in and of itself, and that even by doing this they were still preparing for armed struggle, so there wasn't even a huge difference. Gabba gabba hey. And I shudder at saying these things sometimes, but to be fair to Pol Pot, he has fled to the jungle to avoid what he considered to be imminent imprisonment or probably death at the hands of Sihanouk's security forces. He would have personally known many who had been killed, including his mentor and the previous leader, Tu Samut. He had abandoned his life as a teacher in the city and begun living in the jungle, focusing solely on revolution and wanting to free his country from, in his eyes, a kind of feudal ruling class which exploited the people. In his view, his country was rife with injustice, and he was leading a movement that was attempting to end this. This is like the young person at the party, all dressed up and ready to talk, explaining what they felt was something important to them, and the so-called adults in the room having a little chuckle, patting them on the back and saying, "Look, the world doesn't really work that way. Or maybe when you grow up, you'll understand. Sihanouk must be left in place." For Pol, this was perhaps a great example of what he might be coming to expect of his Vietnamese comrades, of this fraternal relationship where the Cambodians were always the younger brother. As per usual, Philip Short's summary of this exchange is far more graceful and articulate than I could hope to be, so I will quote him at length. A more subtle negotiator, a Zhou Enlai or a Ho Chi Minh, might have been able to sweeten the pill. That was not Le Duan's style. He showed an almost visceral insensitivity to Cambodian concerns. All the old Vietnamese hobby horses were trotted out anew. The Khmer struggle was inseparable from those in Vietnam and Laos. Vietnam had had to wait for the success of the Chinese Revolution before it could defeat the French, and similarly, Cambodians would have to wait for a Vietnamese victory before their revolution could triumph. After Vietnam won its freedom, Cambodia would automatically follow. The Cambodians' stress on self-reliance was excessive, Le Duan argued. What mattered was international solidarity. To bolster his case, Le Duan proposed that the Cambodian leader review the history of the two parties' relations from texts in the Vietnamese archives, certain that the accounts of Vietnam's heroism and selflessness in aiding the Khmer's struggle over the years would win him around. Sa spent days poring over party documents and drew his own conclusions. And now Short quotes Pol Pot recalling these conclusions. "I found that from 1930 to 1965, all the Vietnamese Communist Party documents depicted the Cambodian and Lao People's Revolutionary Parties as branches of the Vietnamese Party. Both parties implemented the rules, the political line, and the strategy of the Vietnamese Party. Until I read these documents myself, I had trusted and believed the Vietnamese. But after reading them, I didn't trust them anymore. I realized that they had set up party organizations in our countries solely to achieve their aim of the Indo-Chinese Federation. They were making one integrated party to represent a single integrated territory." End quote. So this is kind of a pivotal point, more in that it foreshadows some of the more serious tensions beginning to form between the mentor and the mentee. Now, historians for a long time had little to go off about these clandestine meetings, other than a rather, how would we say, problematic text published by Democratic Kampuchea in 1978. It was probably written by Pol Pot and was titled Livre Noir, or the Black Book. I only just got my hands, electronically speaking, on it a few months ago, and having seen it referenced in nearly every book about the Khmer Rouge, it lived up to the hype. Chandler describes the book as a polemical document, written to justify Cambodia's conflict with Vietnam, as their relations had reached their lowest point in 1978. He says it is, quote, "a melange of truth, reconstructed history, and wishful thinking," end quote. I mean, for instance, the very first paragraphs are a pretty good indication of what's to come. I'll quote it here. "Democratic Kampuchea, full of goodwill, is firmly determined to maintaining close and friendly relations with all countries having common borders with her, and with all countries, near or far, throughout the world, on the strict basis of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity," which they then point out is directly from the Constitution of Democratic Kampuchea, Chapter 16, Article 21. It goes on. "That is the sincere aspiration of the Kampuchea people and the basis of the foreign policy of Democratic Kampuchea. But Vietnam, which has always had the ambition to annex and swallow Kampuchea, and to exterminate the nation of Kampuchea through its sinister strategy of Indochina Federation, has carried out the most perfidious activities for many decades, aiming at achieving its objective." End quote. So that's a pretty clear sort of thesis statement. And it just goes on for a while about all the bad things Vietnam had done for a few centuries. Biased as it is, it's still a very useful and interesting source, and we will return to it a few times throughout the rest of the series, but I thought I would just introduce it here as it does reflect some interesting developments out of this meeting in 1965 between Le Duan and, the Vietnamese Workers' Party and Pol Pot during his stay in Vietnam. Firstly, as Chandler points out, this biased text, which highlighted at least a lot of Pol Pot's obsessions in 1978, was also what historians had to use to look into these early meetings. But in the 1990s, historians of Vietnam like Christopher Gosha and Thomas Engelbert had found documents within Vietnam that actually confirmed at least some of the events that were described in the Black Book. It says that Le Duan presented Pol with a document in Vietnamese, which called on them to renounce revolutionary struggle in Cambodia and wait for the Vietnamese to win, and saying that Sihanouk could be used to appeal to the Cambodian people. So stick with him. Pol would characterize this in the Black Book as Le Duan criticizing them sharply for adopting their own independent strategy. Quote, "The Communist Party of Kampuchea had its own political line. Thanks to that line, the revolutionary movement in Kampuchea had taken wing. This disturbed the Vietnamese, because if the revolution in Kampuchea developed and strengthened itself independently, they would be unable to control it." End quote. So despite the way that Pol is choosing to describe this some 13 years later, which was no doubt a rather humiliating experience, he makes it out that the Vietnamese were threatened by the Cambodian party. But he saves a bit of face in this account by stating that, quote, "The conflict on the question of the political line was very bitter, but the Cambodian delegation preserved its calm and did nothing to annoy the Vietnamese. After the departure of Pol Pot," he's talking about himself in the third person, "the Vietnamese knew that the Communist Party of Kampuchea would maintain their line, which was to carry out armed struggle in combination with political struggle." End quote. Now, this is an interesting way of putting it, isn't it? That he preserved his calm, and that at the end the Vietnamese knew that they were more or less going to do as told, for the time being. Philip Short writes in his biography, quote, "Characteristically, he hid his feelings behind a wreath of smiles. His hosts failed to register the malaise developing between them." End quote. Chandler suggests some of what I was alluding to before, that you can kind of see where they are coming from. Like, it's been a rough trot for them for a while, and they want progress. The delegation had arrived with Pol as the leader of a sovereign party, and their views were not treated with respect by the Vietnamese leadership. But if Pol had been more obviously put out by these discussions, it would have been very easy for the Vietnamese to simply replace him. He swallowed his pride, and by his silence, he seemed to accept Le Duan's advice. Now, a good indication that this is how the Vietnamese also saw how this went, aside from not replacing Pol, obviously, is that they allowed him time to study there. They let him speak to the Khmer Viet Minh who had been in Hanoi for about a decade. He gave a speech to them, many of whom had taken Vietnamese wives and found jobs as public servants in the North Vietnamese administration. Short describes the speech as thus, quote, "He appears to have said little about the proposed shift to non-peaceful struggle, or about self-reliance, partly to avoid irritating Le Duan, no doubt, but also out of a wariness toward this group of Khmer Communists, 400 or 500 strong, representing about a fifth of the whole of the party's strength, who had lived outside Cambodia for 10 years, whose thinking was deeply influenced by Vietnam, and whose allegiance must have seemed uncertain." End quote. Interestingly, Short also alludes to some of the reservations that the North Vietnamese did have about Pol and his visit. Following his interactions with those Khmer Viet Minh, a copy of Lenin's text, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, was distributed to the remaining Cambodian communists. And this was basically a way of warning them of Cambodian adventurism. I had a quick look at this text, and from what I can gather, it's basically, well, it's very Leninist, which was Vietnam's favourite flavour, but it generally suggests that the Russian Revolution was the way of doing things, so stick to that. A subtle nod perhaps to the growing schism between the Soviets and the Chinese about who had the best recipe for revolution. So if that is the kind of highbrow way of conveying their subtle concerns about the new Cambodian communist leader and the direction that he seemed maybe was taking the party, they did have a more practical plan as well. They set up a secret military unit, codenamed P-36. It was designed to train Khmer officers so that if and when armed struggle did occur in Cambodia, Vietnam would have its own Cambodians loyal to Hanoi, ready to insert into that conflict and assume leadership over segments of troops or something similar. A kind of preemptive, pack a coat just in case you might need it. They were also not too impressed that Pol had failed to pay what they felt was proper deference to Ho Chi Minh, when he referred to him as an equal comrade, and not using Uncle Ho. And again, I feel the need to defer to Short's writing here as a sort of wrap-up for his Pol Pot's visit to Hanoi. Quote, "The 1965 visit was a watershed moment. Until then, Cambodians had chafed at what they saw as heavy-handed Vietnamese paternalism, but had never seriously questioned that they shared a common objective. After the talks in Hanoi, Sa concluded that Vietnam's interests were incompatible with, if not inimical to, those of Khmer Communism. On ground made fertile by old hatreds, the seeds of enmity were re-sown. But that was not apparent at the time, and both sides continued to act as though they were brothers in arms." End quote. And perhaps the clearest way these brothers in arms demonstrated just how brotherly they were and just how in arms they were, was that at some point during Pol's visit he requested also to go to Beijing. And while this took a few months to be organised, it was approved. If there were serious concerns at this point on behalf of the Vietnamese, again, they wouldn't have let him go. But just as the visit to Hanoi would prove very important in the development of the Khmer Rouge attempts to forge their own path, so too would Pol's visit to China, particularly given the time that it took place. In any case, the Vietnamese flew him alone to Beijing, and Pol arrived toward the end of December 1965. The moment that Pol arrived in Beijing was, it was heating up, to put it one way. This was on the eve of the Cultural Revolution, something that I think we may need to explore in at least some superficial detail in an upcoming episode. To preview it slightly, essentially after Mao had taken a step or two back after the failures of the Great Leap Forward, he was ready to kick the door back in and instigate a kind of, what's in the name, isn't it? A cultural revolution, in line with his views on continual revolution and not letting things get stale. And stale they would not be. The late 60s in China is a dark time, but one person's darkness is another's rich ideological glory, so I don't know. Either way, this was a rather exhilarating time for a Cambodian revolutionary to visit China, particularly following his time in the jungle, and even in comparison to the preoccupation with war that had engulfed North Vietnam. Not to mention the very real, threat that must have pervaded that atmosphere. China, having secured its revolution, having no proper war but a war of ideas to participate in, was in the midst of this huge ideological campaign. If you'll recall, my dear listener, back in, it was a while ago now, it would have probably been Pol Pot in Paris Part 2, or maybe Part 1, the young Salot Tsar visits Yugoslavia on a kind of summer working trip between semesters. He was in awe at the scale of what the masses of people were producing there back in 1950. And Chandler suggests that a similar effect may have taken place on his visit to China. The sheer enormity of what they had accomplished, with no obvious hints of the toll that it had taken, presumably. But if nothing else, the way in which the population was able to be mobilized was remarkable. Only a year earlier, China had conducted its first nuclear bomb test. China was huge, full of possibility. Remember those people of this political persuasion, particularly from the developing world, or those casting off colonial ties in this time, we have to remember about just how much hope they had, how convinced they were of the reality of Marxist theory, and how this must have been stark evidence of the reality of this ideology. This vision of China cannot be understated, nor can the effect of those that perhaps may have personally engaged with Pol during this visit. It's worth noting that Pol is not visiting Beijing as a head of state, far from it really, particularly given that Sihanouk himself had recently been afforded that kind of visit, and warmly received too. No, Pol was there as a revolutionary, a visitor friendly to the cause, and in reality, not as an independent one, but a Vietnamese ally. And we can touch upon that more in a moment, but I wanted to bring to attention something that Chandler brings up in Brother Number 1 that does serve as one of these, oh, is that where that influence came from kind of things, or at least something that might bolster an already embryonic attitude and modus operandi. Given that Pol is not getting the head of state treatment, he is instead greeted by a Kang Sheng, a senior communist cadre who had often been in a leading role of Mao's secret police. Chandler suggests that since Kang Sheng had returned from the Soviet Union in 1937, he had, quote, earned a reputation for deviousness and for presiding over several ruthless, far-reaching purges. It seems that he had befriended Pol during the visit, and that, although no record of his conversations with Tsar survived, it seems likely that Sheng praised the radicalism of Tsar's revolutionary stance, and pointed out to him the importance of locating and rooting out internal enemies. End quote. But it was not just a few choice words from a brutal head of police that would stick in Pol's head. 1966 was also the year that a new edition of Mao's Little Red Book came out. These short, easily memorized phrases that encapsulated Mao Zedong thought was printed in the millions. A feat perhaps in and of itself that would have impressed Pol, but the content itself, remember Salat Tsar had been a teacher until he went full jungle communist, these 300 or so sort of exhorting phrases or short excerpts from speeches and writings seemed to gel well with the kind of pedagogy he was used to. And here is a little example of a Little Red Book quote. In class society, everyone lives as a member of a particular class, and every kind of thinking, without exception, is stamped with the brand of a class. End quote. Or, we must have faith in the masses, and we must have faith in the party. There are two cardinal principles. If we doubt these principles, we shall accomplish nothing. Or, the classic, every communist must grasp the truth. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So the messages too are important, not just the way that they are conveyed. Chandler describes this impression Pol was getting from this ideological ferment as such, quote, as a communist, Tsar was drawn to Mao's emphasis on continuous class warfare, individual revolutionary will, and the importance of poor peasants, ideological areas in which China differed from Vietnam and which were later emphasized in democratic Kampuchea. Tsar may also have been drawn toward the conspiratorial, class-based explanations of politics in China so dear to Mao. End quote. But there was another ideological difference between China and Vietnam coinciding with Pol's visit, something that, if we return for a second to that metaphor of the young person arriving at the adult party all dressed up but having their big talking points kind of poo-pooed by a group of adults, well, we can almost imagine a slightly disheartened kid taking a break away from the party when some kindly avuncular figure approaches them and says, hey, I heard what you said back there, and I actually think you might be onto something. I think your attitude is actually pretty impressive, with a couple of pats on the back. All of the arguments that Pol had brought to Vietnam would more or less be encapsulated by a widely read and publicized article from the Chinese Defense Minister, titled, Long Live the Victory of People's War. Its central message was that the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were now the standard bearers of the world revolution, who would storm the citadels of capitalism in the US and in Europe, and this message of it being like, it's your turn, and you are the important ones now, was a very uplifting message for these kinds of revolutionaries. It said that the liberation of the masses was accomplished by the masses themselves, that this was a basic principle of Marxism-Leninism, that revolution in any country is the business of the masses of that country, and should be carried out primarily by their own means and effort, that self-reliance was paramount, and that people's war was the most recognizable way to distinguish between genuine or fake revolutions, that the peasants constitute the main force of the national revolution against the imperialists and their lackeys, and that, quote, the countryside, and the countryside alone, can provide the basis from which the revolutionaries can go forward to final victory, end quote. The article emphasized the importance of revolutionary will and proletarian thinking and consciousness, not just how many guns you had. As Philip Short points out, here was the justification of all of Pol's arguments. Here was something that said, yes, you are on the right track. You do not need outside permission or help to succeed. Just the will to succeed. All of your convictions are correct. Essentially, Pol is getting, from his perspective, a much appreciated second opinion. In his meetings with Chinese officials, they seem to wholeheartedly support the so-called political line that he and the other Khmer leaders had come up with. Pol detects a much greater enthusiasm for quicker movement, just like the Vietnamese had made in South Vietnam back in the late 50s. He felt he was getting this in his meetings, as well as in the propaganda that we just discussed. They basically say, like, you've done your homework, you've got the US on your doorstep, every communist needs to fight that, and if you want to do that, well, the best thing to do is take hold of the peasantry and go for it. Now, aside from getting, the equivalent of a very assuring wink of approval, the Chinese, just like the Vietnamese, were really not on board for armed struggle developing in Cambodia just this instant, for pretty much exactly the same reasons as the Vietnamese. Except China is sort of acting as the benefactor for the Vietnamese at this time too. So, they aren't looking for another bill. And let's not forget, this whole thing isn't that far from China. Just like the end of the war with the French and how it looked like everything might get a little crazy there for a bit, the Chinese don't want to actually have to get in and do some fighting. Just like the US are being very cautious not to do anything that would lead to the outbreak of war with China and the Soviets. A nice little proxy war will do everyone just fine for the moment. Thank you very much. And again, it's worth mentioning the Chinese are in the midst of setting up this deal with Sihanouk to send the Vietnamese supplies via that Cambodian port. They've just had him on a state visit. Sihanouk is pro-China. They really don't want him gone right now. Steve Heder contends that the Chinese were actually hoping that Lon Nol, who we will discuss a fair bit in the next part of the episode, they think he has done and said enough that even he might be counted on to fight against the United States if they invaded Cambodia. And if that was the case, the Cambodian communists would have to be counted on by a Lon Nol Sihanouk coalition to fight the United States using Chinese weapons. That was a little fanciful, but as we will find out in a few episodes' time, not that dramatically far off what will end up occurring. But unlike Le Duan specifically, the Chinese interlocutors are, they're basically nicer about their messaging. As I said, they endorse the Cambodian communist political line. They tell Pol Pot it's anti-revisionist, which is communist vocabulary for good. They tell him how clever he is for focusing on the peasantry. They say he should actively struggle against US imperialism, but short of using that phrase, armed struggle. They even offer him some material support, but Pol, perhaps chuffed enough at having his ideas considered and listened to and given the thumbs up, he declines this for the moment, saying it isn't quite time yet. Now, the background thing here, which is a bit like that cool uncle at the party giving the kid a pat on the back and saying, you know what, I think you've got what it takes, and I don't know, giving him his business card or something. This uncle, maybe he has a little agenda too. Maybe he doesn't just think the kid is cool. As Philip Short says, quote, the Chinese were also always looking for new allies in their dispute with the Soviet Union. Indeed, had there been no Sino-Soviet split, Pol's task would have been far harder. And despite the fraternal relationship between Vietnam and China, which throughout the 1950s and 60s was far and away Hanoi's biggest provider of military aid, well, the emergence of an independent Khmer Party to offset Vietnamese dominance in Indochina was certainly not against Chinese interests. End quote. Pol is sent home in May of 1966, just as the great proletarian cultural revolution was being launched. In February, having returned from Beijing to Hanoi, back to the North Vietnamese, Pol met back up with the rest of the delegation which had originally come from Office 100. Speaking to Kiernan, he explained how China would be an important relationship to foster if they were going to keep their distance from the Vietnamese. That the Chinese could give spiritual, political, and strategic support. That they didn't need to have any doubts about the correctness of what they were doing anymore. They set off back to Cambodia, but this return leg of the journey would take more than twice as long, as American bombing targeting the Ho Chi Minh trails was proving to, at least, disrupt their utility. In fact, Office 100 itself, on that border between South Vietnam and Cambodia, was within this area of intense American firepower. These raids could be heard as far away as Phnom Penh, like a terrible thunderstorm in the distance. How poetic, almost like some kind of physical embodiment of some kind of, historical hurricane. Now, when Pol does arrive at Office 100, or what was left of it, he meets back up with the other leaders like Yang Sa-ri and Nguyen Chea. And just a little note here, continuing that idea we touched on in the last episode, but Nguyen Chea had basically been managing party activities during the almost a year that Pol had been gone. Just reinforcing that notion that he is a trusted and very highly positioned person within this structure. Anyway, Nguyen Chea was not actually permanently stationed at Office 100. He was there at the time on one of his little visits from Phnom Penh. Anyway, when Pol meets with them, he also learns that during his time away, a Vietnamese, I think it's a military leader, had met with those leaders that were still remaining at Office 100 and had also told them not to make any plans that would damage the relationship between North Vietnam and Sihanouk, essentially echoing the same messaging that Pol himself had received from Le Duan. This bothered Pol. He felt that they, the Vietnamese, had done this kind of behind his back. Further evidence, perhaps, to bolster his growing suspicion and frustration. He called another meeting of the Central Committee and zone leaders to discuss another party program, and this 1966 study session would mark a turning point in Cambodian communism. There are three main takeaways from this meeting. The first is that, Pol had come back from China with a little something. Now, you'll recall earlier when I spoke about the symbolic nature of the naming of their movement, the meaning behind having changed it from Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, which was a name that had been given to them from the Vietnamese, to the Khmer Workers' Party, which signalled their self-esteem in comparison to the party in Hanoi. Well, in 1966, at this study session, Pol felt emboldened to do this once again. With the confidence that had been felt during his discussions with the Chinese, and perhaps as a little gift bestowed by them, although that's not 100% confirmed, he announced that the party would be renamed the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the CPK, which will remain from now right through their time in control of Cambodia. Naturally, this also signals that, perhaps, they are disassociating from the Vietnam Workers' Party, and also that they felt that they had advanced toward a truly communist program that was superior to the Vietnamese one. It also contradicted the Vietnamese view that the Cambodians, even Cambodia itself, was not ready for this development. Now, perhaps just changing the name of the party doesn't seem like a huge deal, but if you consider that they also kept it secret, even from the lower-ranking members of the party, not to mention the Vietnamese, you can see that it certainly was a big deal for them. And hey, even just for the podcast, look, it took me 5 years, but we finally got to the point where I can simply say CPK, which is what I've been used to calling them for a very long time, so it's much easier for me at least. Okay, so there's this name change, but this meeting also established two more important developments. Office 100 was going to be moved. Now, the excuse given to the Vietnamese was that it was for safety, due to the proximity to these B-52 bombing raids, which seems pretty reasonable. But in reality, it was to escape the surveillance and overbearing control of the Vietnamese. Yang Sari had said that even telegrams coming from Nguyen Chea in Phnom Penh to the jungle headquarters had to go through the Vietnamese first. So they wanted out of that relationship, or at least that aspect of it. The new location would mean that they would have a base of their own, and it would be on Cambodian territory. They decided that Ratanakiri in the northeast would be the ideal spot, and it being situated in this foresty, hilly region where upland minorities were populated would also have some strategic benefit, as well as allowing for more autonomy from the Vietnamese. I'll touch on that more in just a moment. Now, the final development from this meeting was that Pol was determined to prepare for armed struggle. Yes, the political struggle would continue, and we will follow the advice from Vietnam and China to an extent, but that the Chinese had endorsed what Vietnam did, well, that was kind of this own message in itself, wasn't it? That's what we are going to do. If China endorses that, well, why can't we do that too? Zone leaders were instructed to begin making preparations for armed struggle in rural areas, but the wording of this was still light enough to not overtly offend and defy the Vietnamese. But it was still a rejection of Le Duan's briskly given advice, and a definitive move toward war. This was coupled with a decision to try and avoid reliance on Vietnamese military and political support, that they would reject any future offer of large-scale military intervention to assist revolution in Cambodia, because this would mean that they would always be dominated by the Vietnam Workers' Party, and signal this Indochina Federation that they feared was the secret intent of the Vietnamese communists, and what Pol felt that he had, uncovered during his stay in Hanoi. Given this change in direction, we can also see how the Cambodian communists had more firmly committed to the notion that Sihanouk was not going to be treated in the way that the Vietnamese wished. Now, part of this is, naturally there is a frustration that would have been born of the repression that their movement faced from his government. But at the same time, they're being told they can't do anything to fight against him, and that they would be better to simply co-opt him into their propaganda. Something else had happened in the last year, which prompted a serious re-evaluation of how the Communist Party could exist in Cambodia with Sihanouk. It didn't happen in Cambodia, however, and this is just another example of those outside pressures and weather patterns influencing a hurricane somewhere else. But from a communist perspective, something terrible had happened in Indonesia. I'll quote David Chandler here from Brother Number One. I understand he used to teach a college class about this back in the day, so, he's a smart guy. Quote, "In September 1965, the Communist Party of Indonesia, the largest in the non-communist world, had been tangentially involved in a coup attempt in which several high-ranking army officers had been killed. The flamboyant Indonesian chief of state, Sukarno, had not been threatened, but the army's response to the abortive coup was harsh. Between October 1965 and March 1966, approximately 500,000 suspected communists were massacred by army troops, local militia, and enraged civilians. Thousands of others were imprisoned. Indonesian communism ceased to exist, and Sukarno soon lost his political position. He was replaced by the man who had coordinated the repression, General Suharto. News of the Indonesian massacres and Sukarno's ouster must have reached Salot Shah while he was in China, and probably made him warier than ever of allying with a charismatic national leader like Sihanouk, who could offer little shelter if the pro-imperialist army of Lon Nol decided to crack down. The Vietnamese, however, continued to press this potentially suicidal alliance on Salot Shah, even though they would be in no position to bail their Cambodian brothers out if they were targeted by Lon Nol. End quote. What happened in Indonesia was an instance of state-sponsored mass murder, a hugely miserable event. Some listeners may be aware of or have seen the 2 documentary films made about this horrible period of history, directed by Joshua Oppenheimer, The Act of Killing, and the sequel, The Look of Silence. This topic could use a whole podcast in and of itself to explain, so for the sake of brevity, I will not go too far in that direction, but if you are interested, I would urge you to check out those films. They are unique and brilliant in the way that they bring perpetrators and victims together in quite remarkable ways. But, as Chandler says in that quote, the effect it has on this story is quite large. The Cambodian communists have this example from just across the South China Sea of a whole massive communist group being violently wiped out. If there were some genuine reasons to some of the CPK's paranoia, well, this would constitute one of them. The parallels between the ruling party and regime in Indonesia and the communists would have been startling. They felt that they must act and that they could not trust the structures in place to protect them if something similar happened in Cambodia. It was around this time that Sihanouk's crackdowns in Phnom Penh meant that there were more and more cadre fleeing to join the leadership in the countryside. In fact, while Pol was in China, Sihanouk had ordered the arrest of several alleged communists in the capital, warning the rest that unless they ceased their activities, he would kill them. In response, in Sao Pim's eastern zone, communist documents began to be circulated, calling for the prince's overthrow, in direct contradiction of advice from abroad. As I mentioned before, the move to Ratanakiri also placed the party amongst ethnic minorities in these more isolated areas of Cambodia. In this new atmosphere of perceived threat, the leadership found an unlikely ally. Over the years, the peoples of Ratanakiri, which is a beautiful place I might add, as well as some of the other regions around here, like Kratchet, Mondulkiri, well, they had become increasingly put out by the Sangkung government. Roads, rubber plantations, settlers and foresters had advanced into their lands. So these peoples like the Charai, the Tapuan, the Brau, we need to remember that like many countries, there isn't just this one ethnicity. Sure, Cambodia is mostly made up of Khmer, but they are simply the dominant group. And these minorities had been subjected to assimilationist nationalist policies, forced relocation and labour, heavy taxation, and even arrests or executions of those who protested or resisted. Now, it's a generalisation, sure, but these people basically hate the government by this point. And due to their societal workings, they're kind of seen by the Cambodian communists, even in Marxist theory more generally, as living in a kind of primitive communist society. As Chandler says in Brother Number 1, these tribespeople have an ideological significance. They don't have access to money, markets, or most of the trappings of the state. They were kind of uncorrupted. They were also, in Maoist terms, poor and blank, a kind of perfect mould to project communist teaching upon. This worked out in a couple of ways for the communist leadership. First, these people, although the phrase that would have been employed was backward, could be keenly politically aware, and they could help with the revolution. They were also seen almost like a kind of role model for some of the urban intellectuals of the CPK. It became this kind of symbiotic relationship, and many members of these minority groups would become trusted bodyguards, messengers, and party members. This was particularly useful at this time, as Pol and the other leaders wished to begin their moves toward armed struggle by organising a permanent armed guard to protect the upper echelons of the party. Okay, so we've covered most of the significant directions that the CPK are going to be moving in after 1966 and into 1967. They're moving toward preparing for armed struggle. They have physically and somewhat ideologically distanced themselves from the Vietnamese, running their operation, and China has become a new de facto ally. Now, it should also be said, as Steve Heder points out, and in keeping with his thesis about the Vietnamese blueprint kind of argument, that although Office 100 has been moved in a way which allows more autonomy from the Vietnamese, it is still basically just across from the border from a Vietnamese military stronghold. They aren't going full hermit here. They are still within touching distance, still in contact. But this period between 1965 and 1966, as we've discussed, has been very important for the development of this more independent CPK. It has taken them a series of small steps to get to this point, and there will be more to come, but they are grinding the gears together now, and they want their time. A major outbreak of civil war and a massive change in the politics of Cambodia is just around the corner, and the time will be ripe for the CPK to take advantage. If 1966 was a turning point for the Cambodian communists, it was also a turning point for Cambodian politics generally. Chandler points out that this was really only visible in hindsight. No one really saw the events that happened at that time having the effect that they would have at that time. People assumed that Sihanouk would simply continue playing the lead as he had for the last couple of decades, but a chasm had formed just over the horizon. In this part of the episode, we're going to explore this same time period we have been covering, about 65 to 67, but focus now on Sihanouk and developments in Cambodian politics and society. In the last episode, we explained how Sihanouk had taken measures to cut off Cambodia from the United States, financially, militarily, and diplomatically. The effect this had, as well as the war in Vietnam, will destabilize Cambodia in a few ways, notably economically, and Sihanouk's decision to flirt more with the eastern side of the Cold War divide will also have ramifications domestically. Somewhat counterintuitively, Sihanouk's own policies will also begin to create a social and political climate that would provide a more fertile ground for the underground communists to thrive in as well. Pervading this new atmosphere, generally speaking, will be this, I kind of think of it basically as Sihanouk losing his magic a little bit. So let's explore this further. One of the most striking developments in Cambodia in the early to mid-1960s was how this foreign policy tightrope walk that Sihanouk had been engaged in was producing a very repressive society in some respects. For example, Philip Short explains that at this time, Phnom Penh had 1 policeman for every 60 inhabitants, one of the highest urban ratios in the world. Part of this police presence was formed by a kind of special security unit that reported directly to the Prime Minister's office. And although developments on the global stage had led Sihanouk to adopt this more friendly stance towards socialist and communist governments, at home, this huge police force was tasked predominantly with quashing the domestic communist movement. If a Communist Party organiser was caught, they were killed without trial. Hundreds were killed in this fashion. And naturally, a net being cast that wide was going to catch even tangentially related people to the movement. Short describes an instance in which a youth from a suburban school who had been considered just a communist sympathiser was detained at gunpoint by plainclothes police, stripped naked and thrown in a cell just big enough to stand up in, before being interrogated for a week, where beatings were administered and even simulated drowning. No charges were brought, and this youth spent the next 2 years in prison. When this kind of treatment is being handed out, it's no wonder that this period saw a steep rise in the numbers of younger Cambodians, those under 30, to at least sympathise with, if not join, the resistance against the government. Now, another factor working simultaneously with this was the combination of economic and educational developments which had produced a staggeringly high amount of students in Cambodia in comparison to just a few years previous. By 1963, there were some 600,000 young people in full-time schooling. However, there were simply not enough attractive working positions for these students to take up. You've got this scenario with way too many qualified young people, for most of whom the only job that they would want is within the government administration, and you would end up having like 100 candidates for every position that came up. As Short describes, quote, "The results, as the prince himself noted, was to throw into unemployment ever-increasing numbers of disaffected, semi-educated young men, too proud to work in the rice paddies, as their parents had done, but unable to find anything better. At a humbler level, peasants, ruined by bad harvests and usurious interest rates, flooded into the towns to form a lumpen proletariat of coolies and cyclo drivers living at the margins of society, often in wretched conditions. Everywhere, living standards stagnated, when they did not actually fall, except among the elite, where, in the words of one observer, there prevailed a total absence of civic sense and insatiable appetites for gain. For more and more young Cambodians, Sihanouk was not the solution, but the cause of their country's problems." End quote. And you'll recall, my dear listener, just how well the CPK had been able to install itself, recruiting-wise, within the student population, probably more so than any other group by this point. So you've got tons and tons of disaffected students, and in this prime position to start hoovering up are the communist teachers who could provide them this alternate vision, as well as give them a purpose. As this starts to boil at home, Sihanouk is also constantly trying to set up various conferences and proposals to other countries in an attempt to get a formal recognition of Cambodia's borders, as the region gets a little dicey. You remember a few episodes ago when there was that incident when the South Vietnamese just sort of moved the goalposts, as it were, moving the literal map boundaries by some number of kilometers in order to pursue some war aim. Likewise, US troops are beginning to instigate these search and destroy operations and are giving themselves quite a bit of leeway when it comes to pursuing Viet Cong into Cambodian territory, although this is not official. At this time, the Laotians sort of had a bit of an eye on the Cambodian province of Stung Treng in the northeast, and the Vietnamese had always been unhappy about the maritime borders in the Gulf of Siam. After all, it's only, a little over a decade since all of this was French Indochina, right? So there's this somewhat legitimate concern that Sihanouk has, and probably informed by pretty old-school Cambodian fears, that there is this little chance that Cambodia could, can it survive this whole thing? He's getting a little gloomy with how difficult everything is getting. The war is spilling over into Cambodia. That's happening. So Sihanouk is trying to get this, international guarantee that Cambodia is going to continue to exist, and there just isn't that much interest for this on the global agenda. It's about this time that, again, quite astutely, Sihanouk tells a French reporter that, quote, "The only way to end the war in Vietnam was for a government to be formed in the South that included representatives of the Communist NLF and the existing Saigon regime. This," he argued, "should follow a complete American withdrawal. The new government should then arrange for the reunification of Vietnam to take place over a 10 to 15-year period. If this was not done," Sihanouk said, "South Vietnam would become communist. And when this happened, Cambodia too would enter the communist camp." End quote. So he's kind of got his finger on the pulse, right? At least on this particular issue. But he is losing traction in a lot of other ways. Like, the economy is beginning to turn bad, right under his feet. The easiest thing to point to here is the example of rice. It's always been Cambodia's major export and its principal earner of foreign currency. In addition, the government could also count on the revenues produced out of a system of internal taxes on this product. But as the war in Vietnam escalated, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese need for rice to feed their troops also escalated. By 1966, between a third and a half of the entire Cambodian rice harvest was being sold to the communists on a kind of black market. Everyone knew what was happening, even Sihanouk, but it seemed like there was nothing that could be done. This is, bad. Not only have you voluntarily shut off all of these massive amounts of US aid that had previously helped balance the books, but turns to nationalize certain industries had backfired. And now this old staple, rice, was also being siphoned off by the spread of war. The world didn't care about Sihanouk's pleas to be respected, about Cambodia's borders, about his tentative neutrality. Many Cambodians, people that knew Sihanouk, and even just in the public, began to notice a kind of weariness about the former king, that he was losing interest. The one thing that does offer a momentary distraction for Sihanouk is the state visit of Charles de Gaulle, who is like Sihanouk's hero. Sihanouk has everything all nice for the visit, and he also has a kind of fanciful hope that de Gaulle might be able to pledge some support to Cambodia that would replace at least a fraction of what the US had been pouring in. That wasn't the case, sadly, for Sihanouk. De Gaulle offered very little. A phosphate factory, finance for another school, and some new uniforms for the army. What Milton Osbourne describes as Sihanouk's temporary euphoria about the visit is replaced by a deepening despondency. Now, this is where some of these problems begin to start dividing Cambodia quite a bit. Those, I suppose we could say, conservatives, those who make up Cambodia's pro-Western elite, they're not happy with this deepening relationship with the North Vietnamese and China. They can't stand his economic policies that are more socialist in nature. Also, for those on the left, and we can take this all the way to the extreme by including the CPK, are deeply unhappy with Sihanouk anyway, seeing him, regardless of any actions, as a symbol of feudalism. The students aren't happy with him. A former associate of Sihanouk recalls a night when Sihanouk cried out amongst friends, "I just wish I could quit. I'm so exhausted." He bemoans the fact that the leftists don't like him. He even starts generally calling for austerity measures, starts making these vague declarations that Cambodia would move toward socialism, with no explanation of what that would actually mean, completely empty, all the while still spending the budget on things like the new Olympic Stadium, or building new luxury hotels. But at the same time, he himself is keeping up his very extravagant lifestyle. This is around the same time that he negotiates this deal with China and the Vietnamese about the arms shipments through Kampong Som. Now, part of this deal, this very important part of the deal, was that his Cambodian generals would get something like 10% of these shipments to use in the Cambodian military. He hoped that this would placate his generals, but failed to realize that this assistance to the Vietnamese would actually really trouble some conservatives within the military, even if they were personally profiting from the deal. Sihanouk begins to engage in his time-honoured tradition of just sort of lashing out against critics or perceived enemies, both on the left and right. There's this kind of malaise that infiltrates him at the same time. And he had no one within his advisors or entourage that would dare tell him he was doing anything wrong. But there were growing circles of those who were beginning to deeply resent the prince. The economic downturn, the direction of foreign policy, not to mention the concern about Sihanouk's increasing preoccupation with another of his old hobbies, filmmaking. This was something that he did despite public admissions that the economy was blown. I'll quote Milton Osbourne's biography of Sihanouk to introduce this filmmaking theme. Quote, "By the end of 1965, he was 44 years old. He had been at the head of his nation for nearly a quarter of a century and had been closely and energetically involved in its politics for 15 years. Because of his style of government, he was at the center of all that happened, whether for good or bad. There is every reason to conclude that by late 1965, Sihanouk was physically and emotionally exhausted. It was in these circumstances that he took up the last of his many fads, which became an escape from the political grind in which he felt himself trapped. Unlike such earlier enthusiasms as horse riding and magazine publishing, his filmmaking was to have very real political consequences." End quote. Interestingly, this devotion to filmmaking at a time of national, well if not crisis, it's pretty close, but this need for Cambodia's leader to be spending 1965 through 1969 writing, casting, producing and directing 9 films, well, it may have been prompted by a comment made by Peter O'Toole to a movie magazine. That's the actor who portrayed Lawrence of Arabia, if anyone was wondering. So O'Toole had been in Cambodia in 1964, at Angkor in particular, filming a movie called Lord Jim. Now, O'Toole had a few quotes out there about his time in Cambodia, but I think I tracked down the one that rubbed Sihanouk very much up the wrong way. Quote, "If I live to be 1,000, I want nothing like Cambodia again. It was a bloody nightmare. I really hated it there." End quote. Milton Osbourne suggests that Sihanouk, in response, decided to make his own movies in order to show O'Toole just how wrong he was. It's kind of wild to take that one step further and ask to what extent O'Toole's comment is responsible for Sihanouk's removal from power in a few years, but, I'm just spitballing here, folks. Now, the first thing to know about Sihanouk's movies is that they are not very good. Now, Chandler, who is a little more articulate than I am, describes them as such. Quote, "Because he had no formal cinematographic training, monopolized the stage, permitted no criticism, and listened to little advice, the films turned out to be amateurish and self-indulgent. None of the actors were paid, and budgets were not maintained." End quote. See, now I don't even know why I included that quote. That's what I said, right? Not very good. Now, I've only watched a couple of Sihanouk's movies, but yeah, let's say that was more out of historical curiosity rather than my keen eye for cinema. And this is from a guy whose favourite movie is 1989's The Burbs, starring Tom Hanks, so, I know what I'm talking about. But I suppose we need more nuanced criticisms of Sihanouk's films, and they question the kind of Cambodia that he is portraying. It is all about this version of life that 99% of the population has zero connection to. It's all fancy cars, parades, receptions, and rich people doing pointless things. But he's very unlikely to receive that kind of criticism in person. In fact, one retired British diplomat that was invited to a private screening, well, he likened the movie to, the Sistine Chapel. So that's the kind of feedback he's getting, and I'm sure taking on board. So this is going on while serious issues are facing Cambodia. And he doesn't just make a movie and say, okay, did my movie, back to work. He keeps on going. And then he starts starring in them. Osbourne relays some thoughts from a former translator for Sihanouk about the prince's obsession. Quote, "It may be psychologically significant that Sihanouk chose successively to play the following roles in his films: a spirit of the forest, a victorious general, an intelligence agent, a wounded soldier, and a Japanese colonel. At the very least, a picture emerges of a man for whom fantasy was increasingly more attractive than the real world." End quote. And I think the real, the tragicomic peak of this is when Sihanouk sets up an international film festival in Phnom Penh, and we're skipping ahead a little bit in time, but it's relevant. 1968, 1969, the International Film Festival competition in Phnom Penh. Sihanouk, naturally, enters his own movie. Not only does he enter his own movie, but it just so happens to go into a special class all by itself with himself as the only competitor. And he wins a solid gold trophy on both occasions. Equally as sad, but rather significant, is that it is not only the elite in Phnom Penh who become worried by the prince's movies. In the countryside, Sihanouk commanded that the films be screened for peasant farmers and their families, for his children, as he would describe them, watching in amazement at the kind of life being depicted. Now, to paraphrase Osbourne here, it would not be an extremely difficult task to convince the peasantry who've seen these movies of the evils of that regime. Sihanouk's movies become a potent propaganda weapon against him. They also caused practical problems for the workings of the government. At various points, he was getting the Minister for Foreign Affairs or the head of Cambodia's Air Force to act in these movies. More than that, he would mobilize the meager aircraft that Cambodia had for use in the movies as well. At one point, his demand for helicopters meant that wounded Cambodian troops injured in a skirmish with Thai forces in the Dangrek Mountains had to wait to be medevaced because Sihanouk wanted to use these helicopters. Now, he wasn't told that they were having to wait because he wanted to use the helicopters for some stupid reason, because no one could talk to Sihanouk like that. This caused serious resentment within the armed forces, and they were already questioning Sihanouk's decision-making on other policies. As all of these factors begin contributing to a growing disillusionment with Sihanouk from many quarters, not to mention his own malaise for doing his job, another election is held in 1966. For the first time, however, and perhaps due to his preoccupations with Charles de Gaulle's visit or films, or out of just simply not being quite as bothered anymore to do anything, Sihanouk does not pick the candidates that are up for election, nor does he choose the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And this will end up being a massive deal. Even though it's still a one-party state, this all-encompassing Sankum Party, well, it was always made up of these various factions from right and left. In this election, because Sihanouk didn't pick who was running, the people who end up winning the various seats didn't owe the prince for their election. In fact, some of those who did contest seats and who were openly supportive of Sihanouk were often defeated. This also saw the return of many old-school right-wing candidates, some of whom even had grudges against Sihanouk. Basically, anyone who had a bit of money to splash around as reward for people's votes or spent a bit on political advertising would probably win that seat. And that's pretty much what happened. Although I should mention that a couple of the openly leftist politicians, the Sihanouk version of the Khmer Rouges, did still manage to get re-elected, like Khieu Samphan. The result was that the new assembly was more conservative than any of its predecessors, mostly comprised of businessmen and bureaucrats. A French ambassador wrote to Paris that the only thing that the new members had in common was that none of them were a Sihanouk loyalist, and in all likelihood none of them would have been chosen by Sihanouk. Essentially, he was powerless to stop those who didn't like him from entering government, and that's quite a shift. And while Sihanouk is away on an extended hospital visit, the Assembly chooses the cabinet and the Prime Minister, and they pick Lon Nol for the top job. Now, he's a bit of an enigma. Basically, out of everyone here, he still seems pretty loyal to Sihanouk, and he has been basically from the start. Sihanouk still permits Lon Nol to become Prime Minister because he doesn't see him as a threat. This is a guy who has never been stunningly successful in his job. He has predominantly held military or security roles. He was there with Sihanouk during the Crusade for National Independence and the stage-managed military operations that showcased the prince's heroism in the early 1950s. And his troops had helped get rid of the Democrats, violently, in the 1957 elections. He'd helped Sihanouk with the Dap Chuan plot, and he had been Sihanouk's guy in tracking down, arresting, torturing, and killing communists, Khmer Sarai, renegade students, and other enemies of the state until now. He wasn't dumb. He was the kind of person who might stay silent during a meeting, but then point out the weaknesses of those who spoke later on. But Sihanouk assumed he was unambitious, and that won't quite prove to be the case. He was also very popular with the Buddhists, the army, and non-communist youth. He wasn't flamboyant at all. In allowing for Lon Nol to assume this position, Sihanouk might have also felt that he was warding off any ill feeling coming from the armed forces and conservatives. I mean, this was their guy, you know what I mean? And the pro-Western elite surely would appreciate this too. He was trying to bring the army closer, and in doing so was going to be able to frighten the left. And, he could always fire Lon Nol if there was a disaster, and at the end of the day, he could just dissolve the assembly and have a do-over if things went really bad, right? However, it was only once Lon Nol became Prime Minister that Sihanouk realised just how much the balance of his parliament had changed. And when I say changed, I guess we could rephrase that too. Well, Sihanouk realised just how much his ability to influence things had come under threat. Sihanouk relied on his old techniques of trying to keep right and left in a delicate balance against each other and keeping everything in check. But as the parliament erupted into a kind of factional nightmare, he retreated to France for another extended holiday at the end of 1966. Perhaps hoping this retreat would have the same effects as the one he had dramatically staged in 1953, when he metaphorically locked himself in his bedroom in Siem Reap to let the politicians settle down in his absence. Very much a I'm the main character kind of move. How could they function without him, right? But things didn't quite settle down, and when Sihanouk returns, things will have moved under his feet. At the start of 1967, it could be said that the storm clouds had well and truly formed over Cambodia, and Sihanouk's time was soon coming to an end. And in the next episode, we will explain how rural Cambodia descends into chaos, how the Vietnam War explodes into massacres, and how Sihanouk will fall from his tightrope. Thank you again for listening. Thank you for being here with the show. Again, apologies for the voice, but I sort of had to get this one out now before going on a trip to London tomorrow. So it is what it is. Until next time, everyone. Oh, and if you are still listening, be a darling and give the show a rating and review. Come on. Only takes a minute.